Our daf for today is Chaf Vav, but we still have a piece of Gemara here to finish up from yesterday on Chaf Heyam and Beis. We did the Mishnah, and the Gemara now is medayik from the Mishnah, Ha-hi tira yisa'ena. If the Chacham, when the married woman came to be matir and neder, he declared that the neder is valid and binding, then he's not allowed to marry her after she gets divorced from her husband, because of that suspicion that we have. But if on the other hand he was matir her neder, then if some time down the line her husband divorces her, she can get married to this chacham who was matir the neder. So the Gemara asks, but my askinon, if you're talking about a case of one chacham, is chad mi matzis matir? Can one chacham, without having two other chachamim join him to create a tribunal for Ataras Nedarim, could he be matir the neder? Va'amar Rabbi Chia bar Oven Amar Rav Amram Tana, we learned in a brayso Ataras Nedarim b'shlosha, and the Gemara doesn't recognize at this point in the development of the sugya any possibility of one chacham as a yachid mumcha alone being matir the neder. So it must be that we're talking about Ataras Nedarim in front of three chachamim, and therefore the Gemara asks, Mi chashidi? Are we going to be choshed that one of the three chachamim has an eye on this woman, he wants to marry her, and therefore he was in that tribunal as the otzer hanet, but he needs the agreement of the other two dayanim? But now we have a Mishnah, in a case of miyun in front of this chacham, or chalitza in front of the chacham, he can marry her subsequently. And we're not going to be choshed that maybe people say, oh, this is why he was matir her with miyun or chalitza, because he wanted to marry her. There's no chashad of three people. When one of them, Ki'ilu, has his eye on her, that's he didn't. What did he convince the other two that they should go along with him and ask her? In the case of the neder. So what's going on in that Mishnah? And the Gemara answers, Liola Bechad. Our Mishnah is talking about a case where there was one chacham being matir the neder. In Omer Rav Chizda, Omer Rav Yochanan, Gemara invokes Rav Yochanan's principle, V'yochan mumcha. If you have one person who's an expert, he can be matir neder alone, without three hedyotos. And that's exactly the case that's being addressed in our Mishnah. The Mishnah says, he's allowed, right, he's allowed to marry her. We don't suspect that he was matir her because he wanted to marry her. Time of the Bezdin Hatrelo, is the Mishnah only removing chashad in a case where there are three people because he could not persuade the other two. But if there were only two people, then we have to be choshed that maybe he somehow got his friend in cahoots with him in order to be matir her. Maishna bohadisnan. How is it different than the case of a Mishnah? Shnei edim hachasumim al stei mekach. So Reuven is selling a field to Shimon, and there are two witnesses signed on the bottom of the document of sale. V'al get isha, or two witnesses that are signed on the bottom of a get. And that's fine. If, let's say, one of the two witnesses later wants to buy the field from Shimon, or alternatively wants to marry this woman who was divorced, he can do so. There's permission to do so. We don't believe that he was able to persevere or influence the other aide to falsely testify that the get is a valid get or that the mechira is a valid mechira. So the Gemara answers, you're right. Even in the case of two, there's no chashad. But he gufa kamashbal on the Mishnah sort of agav urcha wants to tell me another chiddush. There is one opinion that miyun does not require a bezdin of three, and a bezdin of two is sufficient. And our Mishnah wants to tell you the case of 3, to tell you that that is the requirement of Bezdin. Kamash Malan, Miyun B'Shlosha, we cannot implement Miyun unless it's in the presence of a Bezdin of 3. Iboilu, the Gemara says, Kanas Mauche Yotzi. In the case where the Mishnah says that he's not allowed to marry her, for example, he brought the get Mi Medina Sayyam, or he testified to the effect that her husband died, or a chacham who asered the neder of a woman, a married woman, and he's not allowed to marry her. What happens to the Eved if he married her? We're going to force him to divorce her? Or is this only a din lechatchila shelo yichnos? Rav Kahana, we have machlokas. Rav Kahana Amar Kanes Motzi. Even by the Eved, we're going to bust up the marriage. Rav Ashi Amar Kanes Eino Motzi. This is only a din lechatchila, he's not allowed to marry her. But if he created facts on the ground by marrying her, then we have to recognize and validate that marriage. And Tanu Rav Zucha the Bay Rav Papi Kid Divrei Omer Kanas Eino Motzi. He paskins like the shita of Rav Ashi, namely that Kanas Eino Motzi. Amalei Rav Hanil Rav Ashi. You said that in Kanas Eino Motzi, that was Rav Ashi's opinion, and apparently we accept Rav Ashi's opinion. L'halacha, is that a Gemara or a Svara? Did you come up with this on your own, or you found a source for it? That's called Gemara. Now, Gemara means you were taught this from some early Mishnah or a Brisa. Amalahu, Rav Ashi responds to Chachamas, Nisani. I have a proof from a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah back on Daf Chav Dalid Amid Beis. Hanitan Mishivcha Vinishtachurcha Me'avodas Kalchavim Vinisgaira Lo Yiknos Vim Kanas Eino Motzi. So we see that there are cases which are recorded in the Mishnah in which you're not allowed to marry this woman. For example, in a case where there's a chashad that you had relations with the shivcha, now she became a baschor and she received the get shivcha from her master, or in the case of a man who's suspect of having a relationship with a non-Jewish woman, and then she converts and now he wants to marry her, lo yichnos, but the Mishnah says him kanas eino motzi. So Alma, we have a precedent here, and here we start on Daf Chavav Amud Aleph. Birnana lo mafkinon, and it means rinu and balaz, meaning when there's rumor about a person that he's chashud, he's suspect of something, because of a rumor, we're not going to break up a marriage. It's hachinami here too. Birnana lo mafkinon. In the case of a chacham who aser the neder of this married woman, then he married her, or a case of a shliach who brings a get, and then he married her. Again, there's a chashad here, but that's only a chatchila. We're not going to bust up the marriage if he went ahead and created new facts on the ground and he married. The Mishnah now on the top of Chavav, v'chulam, all the cases above, they meet. Person brings a get as a shliach, a chacham asers the neder of a married woman, or a person testifies about a married woman that her husband died, and we don't allow them to marry. Shahoylem noshim. But if at the time that they testified, when the shliach brought the get, he testified, or when he asked the neder, or when he testified that her husband died, he was married, umesu, and his wife died later on, mutaros li naselehem, then we don't believe there's a chashad, because at the time of his testimony he was a married man, and we're not going to suspect a married man of intending to somehow get another married man to divorce his wife so that he could marry his friend's divorced wife. The chulon, and also we find the din with regard to all these surim of marriage that we mentioned in our Mishnah, the list of 3 shenisu acherim. If after the edus or avos haget, or after the chacham was oser the neder, and she got married to someone else, Vinis Garshu, and she got divorced from that second husband. So it's the first husband, now the second husband, Oshanis Armalu, or for example, she became a widow when her husband died. Mutarosli nasilehem, the chacham or the aide or the shliach could marry her, because we don't have room for this suspicion lachshosh that they testified or asud the neder purposely, deliberately in order to marry her. That would only apply if he wants to marry her immediately afterwards. But here he flew the coop. In the meantime, she married someone else. Therefore he's allowed to marry her. There's no chashat. However, kulon mutaros livneim olachreim, in all these cases of isur, she's allowed to marry the son or the brother of this chacham or this aide who brought the get. We're not afraid that maybe he testified falsely about the shtar, about the get, or about the death of her husband, in order that his son or his brother should marry her. We don't assume that he's like being paid off, to do what he did in order to facilitate, to allow her to marry his son or his brother. We'll see about his father. So the Gemara is medayik. Mesu in nisgarshu lo. When the Mishnah says that we remove the chshad and he's allowed to marry her, that's only if the matir, meaning the chacham who is matir her neder, or the shliach who is matir her, or the aide who is matir because her husband either gave a get or he died. And now we're saying that if he's married, and his wife dies, then he's allowed to marry this woman about whom he testified, etc. But the implication is that if the chacham who is matir, or the shliach, etc., was matir, divorced his wife, lo, then would be choshesh that really he had his eyes on this other woman. That's why he went ahead and divorced his wife, and now he wants to marry her, even though, again, this is before Cherem D'Rabbeinu Gershon, but still, it was not generally the custom to marry more than one woman. Amalei Rafil Rav Ashi. The Gemara now asks a kasha, Vatanya, we have a brisa, afilu nisgarshu. Even if he divorced his wife, he can go ahead and marry this woman for whom he was also the neder. Lo kasha. The Gemara reconciles the stira between the diuk that we would die from our Mishnah and the brisa that you quoted. Ha dahavi katata beinehem, ha delavi katata beinehem. If there was already tension in the marriage, and there's some indication that he really wants to divorce her, and we have to be choshesh that perhaps he looks at this other woman, a married woman, and he has his eyes on her, and therefore he went ahead and he divorced his wife in order to marry her. In that case, we're choshesh, and we're not going to allow him to marry her. But when the Mishnah says that nisgarshu asurim, delo avi ktata beinehem, and therefore we're going to aser her because we have a chash that maybe he divorced his wife. In other words, if the divorce was in the cooking, so to speak, because there already was a background here of katata, they've been going to see a marriage therapist, and there's a lot of anger and tension in the Mishnah, we're not going to say that, he all of a sudden got his eyes on another woman. The divorce itself was in the making for a long time. But in a case where there was no katata, why all of a sudden is he divorcing his wife? Maybe that's an indication of the suspicion that we have that he wants to marry the other one. Ibai, same in the Gemara, offers another reconciliation. And therefore, both the Mishnah and the Brisa are talking about a case where there was no katata. And we would say, hey, why is he divorcing his wife now and marrying her? Looks very suspicious. But lo kasha ha diargilhu, ha diargilahi. When we say to the Mishnah that if he divorced his wife, he's not allowed to marry her, that's a case where the argilhu argil hu seems to be what we call haschalas haknota. In other words, he started shepherding with his wife and looking for excuses to create marital tension. He starts complaining about the way she prepares supper, and he comes up with all sorts of arguments. Why are you busy the whole day? I don't know, whatever he comes up with. So therefore, why is he starting up with his wife and trying to create a kata and friction in the marriage? Maybe he has his eyes set on this woman. But the law, the Brisa says that even if he divorces his wife, he's allowed to marry her. That's a case where the argila he. Now notice the difference between argil hu in the masculine and argila he. Argila he means that he didn't create any tension in the marriage. She created tension in the marriage. He had no interest in divorcing her. He only divorced her because she started creating tension in the marriage. So there's no suspicion that the reason he divorced her is because he wants to marry the other woman. He didn't instigate this tension. The Mishnah says, Kulam Chinisu. In a case where this woman about whom he testified, etc., got married and divorced, he's allowed to marry her. The Gemara thinks right now that it's Misa, Vigerish, and Agerish. Meaning that when it says in the Mishnah that she became an almana from her second husband, well, the Mishnah gives two scenarios. Either she was divorced from the second husband or she was widowed. Is that case of Misa where she was widowed on Misa? It means that we're talking about a case that the aide testified on the death of her husband. And now she became an almana from her second husband. So that's called Misa al Misa. Once again, let's review it. The shliach of get, that's going to be Gerish. The second option was a witness who testified that her husband died. That's called Misa. Misa. Misa means it corresponds to the case where her second husband died. V'gerishin agerish. It means that she was divorced from her second husband, and he who testified about the get to her first husband is allowed to marry her after she gets divorced from the second husband. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Is a man allowed to marry a woman who was married twice and divorced twice? Name of Masisa Delo Karebi Di Karebi Omar Bitrei Zimni Havia Chazaka. Later on at Daf Samach Dalid, Rebbe is recorded as saying that 2 times is enough for a Chazaka. And a woman who was married to Reuven, and Reuven died. Then she got married to Shimon, and Shimon died. She's not allowed to marry Levi. She's not allowed to get a third marriage. 2 strikes and you're out, according to Rebbe. She's called a katlanit. She kills her husband. We don't mean it with a gun, but she causes his death. So therefore, in this case where she was widowed twice, or alternatively, she was divorced twice, according to Rebbe, that creates a pattern and a chazaka. You don't have to wait for 3 times. That's Rav Shimon Gamliel, who disagrees with Rebbe there. And she's not allowed to get married. Tomorrow says, lo. That's not how we're going to read the Mishnah. We're going to read the Mishnah to reconcile even with Rebbe. That's Misa Gerishin, V'gerishin am Misa. In other words, the case where she got married to a second husband is a case where she was widowed from her second husband. And the witness who testified about her get, meaning that in the first marriage she became a divorcee, in the second marriage she became a widow. Well, Gerishin Amisa, when it says in the Mishnah that she got a divorce from her second husband, that's going on the case where her first husband died. And we don't create a chazaka from almana and grusha. It's got to be either gerushin twice, according to Rebbe, or misa and isarmala twice, but not get and misa. Mishnah says, "V'kulan, all the women that are usher to marry him, for those who are matir, etc., is mutaris libneihem olachehem." They're allowed to marry the son of this chacham or of this aide or the brother. So the Gemara asks, "Maishno mehad is not. How is this different from a Mishnah later on in Daf Tzadi Zayin? Hanitan mina isha, a man is suspect of having znus with a woman, any woman, even a single woman. And according to strict letter of the law, he's allowed to marry her krovos because the relatives of your wife are asur because you married her, but not because you fooled around with one woman. Therefore, you're not allowed to marry her relatives. But midrabanan asur be'ima ubebita ubachosa. Even if a man is fooling around, or a suspect of it, with a single girl, he's not allowed to marry her close relatives. And we'll see that the Gemara is going to explain that if he marries one of her close relatives and he had this initial relationship, romantic, sexual relationship with her daughter or her mother and so forth and so on, her sister, then we're afraid she's going to marry one of the relatives, like the mother, and then, the daughter that he had a relationship before with, when she was single, she's going to hang around and they'll have yichud together, and then he'll have a relationship with her, which means that now he's not allowed to have a relationship with her mother because it's bita v'ishto v'imo. That's a chiyuv karetz. So Gemara says the following: in the case of a nitan al isha, we're not allowed to marry. He's not allowed to marry one of her relatives in order that he shouldn't hang around with her. In our Mishnah as well, when we said that he's not allowed to marry the woman that he was matir, in the case of a get or misa sabal, why don't we say that he's not allowed to marry her relatives? Because maybe if he marries one of her relatives, they have a pact over here, and they're going to work it out that she, the woman about whom he testified, is going to hang around, and then they'll have some fun together. And the Gemara answers, "Nishei gabi nishei shchichan de azlan, but gavre legabi gavre lo shchichan." The Gemara is saying the following: that there's no connection, no analogy here between the two cases, our Mishnah and the Mishnah later on. Why? Because in the case of the Mishnah later on, if he marries her mother and he had a romantic relationship with her daughter, then women come in and out. They invite each other. The mother invites the daughter, and he'll have yichud, he'll be alone with the daughter, and so forth and so on. However, Gavri legabi Gavri lo shchichan. In other words, it's not shchiach that they go one with the other. So therefore, she's allowed to marry the son or the brother of this shliach or aid or chacham, because we're not afraid that he's going to be hanging around his brother's house or his son's house. That's not the way it works amongst men. They're not so chummy together, and therefore we're not afraid that he might have a relationship with her. Inami, the Gemara offers a second distinction. Delo osron shchivasan adodi nashi delo lo kapti adodi, but gavri the osron shchivasan adodi kapti adodi. It means the following, that if he marries the mother, then she won't mind having, if they have a relationship, if her husband has a relationship with her daughter, because there's no din of answering her on his wife. In other words, his relationship with her daughter, which is a violation of an Isur Kares, nevertheless, it doesn't generate an Isur that would break up the marriage between him and the mother of this girl. And therefore, there's a kind of a looser attitude towards, the freedom of having this intimacy with her daughter. The mother is not so mocked. But here we have a case where this woman marries his son. His son is not going to allow his father to have a relationship with his own wife, because that would bust up the entire marriage. Back to Gemara, why does the Mishnah only mention no? And Achiv, what about Aviv? The implication of the Mishnah that she's not allowed to marry his father, the father of the Chacham, the father of the Eid. Why not? You should say Gavri, Agavri, Kapti Adod. So the Gemara says, Lomi boy come, Lomi boy Aviv. It goes without saying that she's allowed to marry his father, Debuzes B'nei Minei. The son is embarrassed and he's humiliated in the presence of his father that he would have a relationship with her. He's not going to be tempted to have a relationship with her if she's married to his own father. Avol Ibno. But if she marries the ben of the matir, the lobuzes of Ivminei, the father's not so afraid of his son, Ema lo, we would have a havamin in this case that we cannot allow her to marry his son. Kamash Malan, no, we're going to allow her to marry even his son, his brother, or any of the other relatives because of this principle of Gabri Hadodi Kapti. And that is Hadron Alecha Ketzad H's Achiv. And now we start the third parak. Arba Achim. We have Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Shnayim em nesuim l'shtei achos. Ruvain marries Rachel and Shimon marries Leah. Umesu, Ruvain and Leah died. Hanesuim es ha'achios. Hare elu choltzos v'lo misyabos. Who died? It was Ruvain and Shimon who were married to the two sisters. So Rachel and Leah now fall for Yibum to Levi and Yehuda. And in this case, Rachel and Leah will get chalitza. They both fell for Yibum. One fell from, just 1 second. So we had Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, Yehud. Let's get the name straight. Ruvain married Rachel, Shimon married Leah, and Ruvain and Shimon died. So now Rachel and Leah fall for Yibum to Levi and Yehuda. And both of them need Yibum, both Levi and Yehuda. And since both of them are Kukos Yibum to both Levi and Yehuda, therefore Yibum is out of the question. And this introduces the concept that we've touched on many, many times, called Achos Zekukaso. Achos Kukaso means she is the sister of a woman who's Kuka, and Zika is Ke Ishto, and that's called Yesh Zika. And now it's Achos Kukaso, which on a Drabanan level is similar to Achos Ishto because of the Zika that makes it like an Ishus. However, on a Deraisa level, they need Chalitza. So although we're going to block Yiva because of the Isur of Achos Kukaso, but Chalitza they require. V'im kandvu v'kantzu yotziu. If the brothers went ahead and they try to take the law into their own hands, and they each married Rachel and Leah, etc., then asuros. We're going to force them to give a get. We're going to break up the marriage because of achos kukasa. Rabbi Lezer Omer, this issue is a matter of controversy. Beit Shammai Omer Yekayim. If the brothers went ahead and they married the two sisters, then we're not going to require a get. Beit Hillel Omer Yotziu. We require a get. Now the Mishnah is going to quote a scenario in which one brother is allowed to be miyabem one of the two sisters. And the obvious question is going to be, what about the Isra of Achos Chalutzasa? And the answer is, Hoisa Akas Men Asura al Ha'echad Isra Erva, is then Asur Ba Umuter Ba'chosa. This is not called Achos Kukaso because his relative, his Erva, does not fall for Yibum. Therefore, the other sister falls for Yibum, and she's not Achos Kukasa because there's no Zika to an Erva. Vasheni also b'shteya. But the other brother, who doesn't have an Erva relationship with any of these sisters, then he cannot implement Yibum with either of them. Because now we have a situation of Achos Kukasa. Each one is Achos Kukasa because there's a Zika of both Rachel and Leah to this brother. In the case of an Erva, that's to the other brother, she's an Erva, so she doesn't have a Zika relationship. He only has one Zika relationship with one of the two sisters, and he's Miyavima, if he so desires. But with regard to the other brother, he's facing the situation of Achos Zikukaso, and therefore also. Now, until now, the Mishnah is addressing a case of Erva. Now we go down a couple of levels to an Iser Mitzvah, which is called Shnios Larayos, or an Iser Kedusha, which is an Iser Lav, like Mamzeres. Is Choletzes Velomis Yabemis. It means that the two sisters require Chalitza from the two brothers, the surviving brothers. I mean, Yibum is out of the question, and that was based on a Kavachomer that we had. If she was Asura to the deceased brother, how much more so she's Asura to the Yavam. But nevertheless, they require Chalitza. And that's called Choletes Velomis Yabemis. So again, the reason why Lomis Yabemis is because of Achos Kukaso, and you're going to have to say that even if there's a Shnias Larayos, which is not an Erev at all Dorais, or even in the case of an Isa Dorais, but it's not an Erev of a Chiv Kares, the Zika is still in place, and therefore the Isra Achos Kukaso applies, and hence Lomis Yabemis. Hoisa achas me'an asur al ze b'isur erva. Bashniya asur al ze b'isur erva. Asur lezeh muteres lezeh. Asur lezeh muteres lezeh. I mean, this is just another application of the same identical principle, that if there's an erva to one of them, he could be miyabim the other one because she's not achos kukaso, and the same in the reverse. Now, this principle that if one of them is an erva, he can be miyabim the other one, and she's not achos kukaso, zui sha'amru. This is the principle that was formulated already in the previous parak. Achosok sheyavimta o choletzes omis yabemis. The sister of the erva can fall for Yibum. So again, it's a case where she was married to the brother of her husband, and the husband died, and both fell for Yibum. So we have two sisters, and therefore there's no Yibum. I'm sorry, and therefore there could be Yibum because there's no Iser of Achos Kukaso because of the erva of Achos Kukaso. The Gemara says the following: Shmami no yesh zika. If our mission is predicated on the Iser of Achos Kukaso, it means yesh zika. That there's a connection between the Yevamot and the Yavam, which is like Ishus, and as a result, her sister is like Achos Ishto. That's called Achos Kukasa. The Ein Zika, if you would hold Ein Zika, then Michti, let's analyze this. Hani, these two sisters, Mitrei Bati Kasina. Each one of these two sisters was married to a different brother, right? Let's say Reuven was married to Rachel, Shimon was married to Leah, and Reuven and Shimon died without any children. Rachel and Leah fell for Yibum in front of Levi and Yehuda. Each one of them was married to a different brother. Hi, Liyabim Chadava, hi, Liyabim Chad. Let Levi be Miyabim, let's say, for example, Rachel, the wife of Reuven, and Yehuda will be Miyabim, Shimon's wife, Leah. And if there's no Zika, there's no Isra of Achos Kukasa. However, our Mishnah says that then there's no Yibum here. We Aser Yibum because of Yesh Zika, and therefore there's an Isra of Achos Kukasa. Says the Gemara, no. The Olam Emelacha. I can reconcile our Mishnah with the Mandiyama who says Ein Zika. And there's an entirely different reason why Choltzos below Misyabmos. Why do we leave out, exclude Yibum? Mishum de Kasavar, our Mishnah holds Asur Levatel Mitzvahs Yevamot. When a woman becomes chayav in Yibum, it's interesting, the premise of this Gemara seems to be that not only is the mitzvah of Yibum incumbent upon him, the Yava, but it's also incumbent upon the Yevama. We cannot be mavatal that mitzvah from her. We cannot rip away the mitzvah of Yibum from her once she fell for Yibum and she was chayav already in the mitzvah of Yibum. So how does that cash in here? Dilma, if you're going to tell me that we're going to go ahead with Yibum, perhaps after, let's say, Levi was Miyabim, Rachel, Eshes, Reuven, Yehuda dies, and Leah is left without a possibility of Yibum or Chalitza. Leah, I'm reading the commentary here, Tishoyer Skuka Levi. Right now, Yehuda died, but Rachel, Eshet, right? But Leah, Eshet Shimon, even after the death of Yehuda, and even after Levi was Miyabim Rachel, she, Leah, Eshet Shimon, requires Yibum or Chalitza. Well, Yibum is impossible because she's the sister of Rachel. So Levi can't be Miyabim Leah. That's Achos Ishta. What about Chalitza? So he writes, Leah, Achos Ishta, Vasur Lisyabim Lo, V'teitze below Chalitza v'Yibum. Not even Chalitza. Because Achos Ishto doesn't fall for Yibum and she doesn't get Chalitza as well. So here was a woman who at one point, with the death of her husband Shimon, fell for Yibum to Yehuda, not to Levi because Levi's Levi's married to her sister Rachel, but to Yehuda. So she had a zika to Yehuda. Now Yehuda dies. She's left out in the cold. She doesn't have an opportunity, neither of Yibum, because there's only one brother left, Levi, and he's married to Ishis Ruvain Rachel, who's her sister. And Chalitza is also out of the question because she now is Eshes Achiv. Is Chos Ishto. Is Kamavatel Mitzvahs Yibum. You took the mitzvah of Yibum that was Chal on Leah with the death of her husband Shimon, and now you ripped it out of her hands. And all this is based on the principle called Chaishina Lemisa, that the halacha always has to take consideration the possibility that somebody might die. So he writes here in the Masechet, "Lachein tiknu chachamim sheyachlotz l'Rachel." Then instead of allowing Levi to be miyabem Eshes Ruvain Rachel, we will force him to give a chalitza, such that now, even in the worst case scenario, if Yehuda, his brother, dies after Levi gave chalitza to Rachel, now Levi could give chalitza to Leah. She's achos chalutza. So achos chalutza is an isa d'Rabbanan. He cannot marry her, but he can give a chalitza. The Gemara asks, "Hachi tlasa nami." Why did the Mishnah have to give a case of 4 brothers? Right, Arba Achen. That's the name of the parak. It could have sufficed with 3 Achen. So it means that Reuven, Shimon, and Levi are brothers. Reuven and Shimon are married respectively to Rachel and Leah. They die without children. And Rachel and Leah now fall for Yibum to Levi. Levi is not allowed to be miyabem any one of them. Why? Let's say we're assuming Ein Zika. He cannot marry any one of them because if he's going to marry one of them, let's say he'll be miyabem Rachel, for example, then he's being mevatel the mitzvah of Yibum from Leah. So therefore, we can establish this requirement of chalitza even in the case of 3 brothers. Why does the Mishnah have to tell me a case of 4 brothers? And if you hold Yesh Zika, then the Mishnah had to be talking about a case of 4 brothers in order to establish achos kukaso based on Yesh Zika. So you want to tell me that Yesh Zika, even in a case of a Yevamot who falls in front of 2 brothers, how much more so in front of 3 brothers? But now we're holding according to the Yomi Ein Zika, and the whole problem is Levatel Mitzvahs Yibumim, and that could apply even in the case of three brothers. And the Gemara answers, Lo mi boy kamrinon. The Mishnah didn't have to tell you the case of 3 Achen. Now that's much more simple than the case of 4 Achen. Lo mi boy tlasa goes without saying that there's an Isa Yibum in the case of 3 brothers. Devadei butler mitzvahs Yevamot. If Levi is going to be miyabim Rachel, then Leah goes out without anything. She's achos ishto. Avol barba. If there are 2 Yevamim that are surviving their 2 deceased brothers, now we have to worry about bittul mitzvahs Yevamim, because if Levi is going to be allowed to be miyabim Rachel, then it could be that Leah is now chayv in Yibum klapi Yehuda, and you might think lemisa lo chayshinon. We don't have to worry about the chash that maybe Yehuda will die. No, kamash malon. We worried about the possibility that Yehuda will die, and then Leah goes out without chalitza. So the Gemara asks, "Hachi